Let's take a look at the Romanov family and the end of a dynasty. On the left, you'll see a picture of Tsar Nicholas II, who will be the last of the Romanov leaders. And the Romanovs had been in power in Russia dating all the way back to the time of Michael Romanov. So for hundreds of years, they had ruled. So, first of all, what was going on in Russia prior to the famous Russian Revolution in 1917? Russia was the only true autocracy left in Europe. In 1884, Nicholas II became the last Russian czar. Sometimes people view this position as a king or an emperor or a Kaiser or a Caesar. And Nicholas II believed that he was the absolute ruler and was anointed by God. So he felt that his decisions were coming directly from God. Now, there had actually been a Russian Revolution that took place in 1905, where we had a famous incident called Bloody Sunday, but Tsar Nicholas II was able to put down that insurrection and set up a new government body known as the Duma, which we'll talk about here shortly. Here's another picture of the famous Tsar, who was related to many other royals throughout Europe. So, a little bit of a reminder about Russia's population. For the most part, Russia was divided into two groups of people: the very rich, which made up the aristocracy, and the extremely poor. During the early 20th century, most Russian people either worked the land as peasants or they worked in some of the newly formed factories. Either job, hours were very long and work was very hard. So, a little bit about the private life of Tsar Nicholas II and his soon to be wife, Alexandra. Nicholas was related to many leaders of royal families in Denmark and Great Britain, Norway, Greece, and Germany. And it was how he met his wife. Alexandra was a princess from the newly formed German Empire, and so he was engaged to her and eventually married. And they were only married for a short time when he inherited the throne from his father, who passed away when he was only 49 years old. This is a picture showing you a photograph of Tsar Nicholas II on the left and his cousin George from Great Britain. So they almost look like twin brothers. So since many of the royals were related, sometimes these people married their first and second cousins, they oftentimes shared many of the same physical traits. So, a little bit about their family. Nicholas and Alexandra had 5 children. Their daughters were Olga, Maria, Tatiana, Anastasia, and their son, Alexei, who would be the heir to the Romanov family dynasty. Many of you have probably seen the Disney movie Anastasia, which is not exactly historically accurate, but does give a little bit of insight into the Romanov family. Alexandra wanted to make sure that her family was very close. Her entire life revolved around her children and her husband, and much of that came from the fact that their son, who was the heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from a very serious disease called hemophilia, in which blood does not clot properly and a person can bleed to death. Now, in today's society, people that suffer from hemophilia can often control this disorder with medications, but back in the early 20th century, not a lot was really known about hemophilia. And so Alexandra and Nicholas II would entrust the life of their son Alexei to a new advisor by the name of Rasputin that we will look at tomorrow. These are some pictures of life as Russian peasants. Very, very difficult on a daily basis to live in these conditions, not knowing if you were going to have food to feed your family, and work was very difficult. So let's talk briefly about Russia's involvement in World War I. So Russia enters the war in 1914, like most countries in Europe, and things did not go well. As we've already studied, Russia is going to suffer major losses on the Eastern Front to the Germans. And so millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing in prisoner of war camps. People in general suffered severe food shortages, and soldiers did not have enough clothing, proper shoes, or even enough weapons to survive. And so many of the soldiers were instructed that if they didn't have a weapon and a soldier next to them was shot, that they should pick up that weapon and fight. The training in the Russian army was very poor, despite the fact that they had one of the largest armies in Europe. This is another picture showing you the plight of the Russian peasants and how many people starved to death during World War I. So, what were some of the serious problems with World War I for the Russians? First of all, Tsar Nicholas II ignored the signs that people were unhappy. He only wanted to see how the war was going to make Russia a better nation. And so a lot of people started viewing Tsar Nicholas II as a weak man because he was being controlled by his wife Alexandra and his advisor Rasputin. And so because the Tsarina wanted to keep the family as closed off as possible from the general public, he became increasingly remote as a ruler, and he did not see the changes that were needed in the way that his country was run. Numerous Soviets, which was a growing communist faction, thus began to appear on the scene. And a lot of this was taking place behind the scenes, and the Tsar did not know a whole lot about it, other than getting some reports from his secret police called the Cheka. This is a famous political cartoon there showing you that the people were tired of the oppression by the Tsar. And you'll notice that with those stars that are kind of surrounding the Tsar there, you see liberty, constitution, freedom, parliament. There was a growing portion of the population that hoped that Russia would become a democratic nation, when in fact only a small part of the population was going to push for communism. So, what finally brought about this change? In early of 1917, February and March, there were riots in the streets of Russia. And so, very much like the French Revolution, women, factory workers, and farmers demanded change. They were tired of being poor and hungry. They were tired of people being killed in the war. And so these groups greatly outnumbered the police and the military, and they were not able to keep the peace. The military will actually end up joining in with the protesters eventually. Tsar Nicholas in March was forced to give up his throne. That is called abdication. So he was forced to abdicate the throne, and then a weak government took over. That government will be known as the Provisional Government, and it will be headed by a man by the name of Alexander Kerensky. They will only be in power kind of until the summer. So the Tsar and his family were captured. Over the next year and a half, they will be moved from many different palaces and throughout the country, and they are kept under watch for 24 hours. Once the communists get control, they are treated much worse than they were at the beginning, and they start to be called by common names rather than being looked at as the former royals. This is just a map showing you of how the revolution spread to a lot of the larger cities. So the opening of the Duma, as I had mentioned earlier, the Duma was originally established shortly after the Russian Revolution of 1905. A Duma is a Russian Congress, so similar to Parliament in Great Britain or Congress in the United States. There were 3 attempts to make the Duma work, but each was too radical and still favored only the wealthiest Russians. In the end, there were too many problems, and it was time for yet another revolution. This is a picture showing you the famous building where the Duma met and the different delegates that represented the Duma. So, what brought about the end of the Romanov Dynasty? In 1917, in late February and March, Lenin started to push for his own ideas to be established. By summer, He was able to push the weak government aside, and the communists, known as the Bolsheviks, took control of Russia with the promise of peace, land, and bread. Peace, Lenin said, would come by pulling Russia out of the war. Land would come by turning the land over to the peasants and to the industrial workers. Bread would come with Lenin feeding the people because they were tired of starving. By 1918, Tsar Nicholas and his family were executed. They were gunned down in a basement. And it's at that point where the communists started to consolidate their control. Vladimir Lenin felt that if the royal family was no longer around, that he would have an easier time consolidating his power. So at that point, the revolution turned into a civil war, but he was able to get control of the country pretty quickly with help from Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. So by 1922, Lenin reorganized the country and named it the Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, oftentimes referred to as the USSR. And Russia joined with Belarus, Armenia, Georgia, and the Ukraine, and became a much larger nation. Later, after World War II, they would also add some of the lost Baltic provinces that they had been forced to give up through the Treaty of Versailles. And we will end here with a picture of Vladimir Lenin, the new leader of the Soviet Union in 1922.